Hi, I'm Carrie Lee Merritt, and welcome to another episode of Meritocracy. I'm sitting here today with two of my friends from Atlanta, King Williams, who is a writer for the Supporter Report and an expert on gentrification and mass transit, and also a filmmaker. And you've got your new film coming out, if you give the people a little bit of information on that.
Sure. It's called The Atlanta Way. It's a documentary on gentrification in Atlanta, chronicling the history of gentrification in our fair city.
And so look for these film screenings coming out very soon. And back with Dr. Sara Patenaude, who is an expert on urban housing development and planning. So thank you both for being here. We're going to have just a little conversation today about our city, about the problems that we're currently facing, and try to brainstorm, I think, really, and we've got a room full of experts of what we can do, not only about our city, but about so many other cities in America, and specifically southern cities who are facing these same problems. Because Atlanta, although our problems are probably more concentrated, so many other cities, as we talked about previously, Baltimore especially, facing some of the same kind of issues. So we had talked a little bit about housing and how housing is so intimately tied with transit, and how that is going to become one of the major issues that all politicians in Atlanta need to be talking about. Can you give us a little bit of background, King, about your work with mass transit?
Yeah, so mass transit in Atlanta is really a thorny issue. Atlanta has always been a transit hub, almost from its inception. So when you have everything from even pre-Civil War Atlanta to even right now, 2019, transit and particularly rail has always been the focus. What's been different, though, is the last 50 or so years on who gets transit and how transit operates. Unfortunately, back in the late 1960s, early 70s, we had a vote for the major counties of MARTA. So if you think of New York, they have the 5 boroughs. Atlanta has the 5 major counties, only 2 of which decided to sign up with MARTA, DeKalb County and Fulton County. And if you look longitudinally, those have been the places that had the greatest growth long term. The other 3 counties that voted against it were majority white and majority conservative. And in doing so, they have seen kind of what's been the downfall of not having transit. They've grown population-wise, they've grown economically, but in doing so, they haven't been able to kind of keep up with the 21st century needs.
Mm-hmm. And so Sara had talked about how the main issue of having density, population density in Atlanta was transportation itself. So you guys are looking at 2 sides of the same coin.
Absolutely. And I think, as we talked about earlier too, that this idea that transportation is a key piece of housing costs, that if you can't afford to live in the city and you're driving because there's no transit, that is also a cost that we need to consider when we talk about affordability.
And literally, you cannot get around Atlanta without a vehicle. I've lived in Atlanta without a vehicle for several years, and it was a mess. I mean, you cannot get from point A to point B without using a system like Uber or Lyft, because we don't even have the cab capacity to get people around the city.
Yeah, and the thing about Uber and Lyft is I always tell people that these are still private companies, and so their overall fiduciary responsibility is to bring wealth to their shareholders. Mm-hmm. So in terms of being affordable, being accessible, that is not really their modus, and so you kind of need to kind of factor that in. We need to start mentioning Uber and Lyft and things like that.
And I do want to push back a little bit, though, because there are people that get around Atlanta without cars every day. But what it does is it costs them a lot of time, and it's extremely difficult. And I think, especially when we think about things like bike lanes, that the way we talk about them is about leisure or about making, an informed choice for middle-class white people to have bike lanes where they want to go. There's already the majority of people that live in Atlanta that use bikes are not going to be in those neighborhoods where they have protected bike lanes.
Mm-hmm. So Decatur in particular has just spent a whole lot of money on bike lanes that have already messed up the traffic flow as we're adding public housing and many more, and making the city much denser. Mm-hmm. And so we're going to be facing that as well. One of the things that King looks at in his new film that's coming out with director Sarah Burns is the neighborhood of Eastlake here in Atlanta. Now, that was something very personal to you, having grown up in this area, correct?
Yeah, it was very personal for me. I grew up in between East Atlanta and Decatur, and one of my dad's best friends used to live right off of Alston Drive. He eventually got priced out. And so when Sarah and Dave McMahon, who hit me up to say, hey, would you like to work with us on this film, I jumped on it immediately. And so telling that story at Eastlake has been something that has been a real treat in my life.
And that will debut early 2020?
Yeah, 2020.
Great. We'll look forward to that too. Now, Sarah, what do you think we can start asking our politicians to do to address these issues, not only of housing and transportation, but of gentrification in Atlanta?
Well, I think the first thing we can ask politicians to do is to listen to the experts. As we've talked, there's a lot of great people in Atlanta who know what they're talking about, but politicians seem to be hesitant to listen to those kinds of voices. And if all you're doing is listening to your funders, then you're not going to be hearing about all the different options. The next thing I think that we really need to push our officials on is thinking about equity in all of these matters. So things like bike lanes, where are they going? Things like transit, where is it happening? And how do we think about those as part of an ecosystem that needs to be equitable for all of the people that live in the city of Atlanta?
And what do you see?
With transit in particular, I think that it's the biggest moneymaker that the city could really, really want, in the state governments. And so now with the supporter report, one of the things I do a lot of is speak to those local officials and then also those donors as well. And so the number one thing they're concerned was, does it affect my bottom line? And so I know myself, it's been interesting to see having to make the shift from telling people about evidence-based policy to just showing what the financial goal is going to be and what the bottom line could be. And it's unfortunate, but that's been, I think, the thing that's been working the most successful right now.
And do you think that film is going to be a new way, a new means of kind of bringing that message home to a lot of people, especially a lot of millennials and people who grew up on digital publications?
I really hope so. I think it's the way we're going about it, in particular for my own documentary and for Sarah's, is we're trying to meet people where they are. So for both of us, we're looking at a strong component in streaming and a strong component in just being a digital first platform. And so even with Sarah's in that documentary on Eastlake, I know they're going to do a theatrical release, but it's more about the person who's under 30 has probably been to a theater once this year. And so how do we get that film out and get the information out to them as quickly as possible? So we're going to have a better campaign to be online. So I'm looking forward to seeing what that generation looks at versus other ones.
Has there been kind of a renaissance in how you're trying to approach the issue to a younger, get the information out to a younger generation?
Sure. So actually, I'm also on the board of a new PAC called Millennials for Progress, where our goal is to get out the millennials and Gen Z out to vote. And absolutely, that it's not just about social media and that kind of digital engagement, but about creating spaces where people can talk about these issues and express what they feel. And that you're not going to convince them, through a traditional phone calling campaign or sending out mailings to get them to donate, that it's going to be these new kinds of ways.
And I think that in particular with engaging younger people, it's particularly about transit, it's going to take just being online. Like I did a recent talk yesterday, and then the number of people there who had never heard of TikTok in the room was like relatively surprised. And they even knew what Instagram was, but they still assumed it was just for pictures. And so just seeing that gap and what people are receiving and how they're relating that information is going to be paramount for getting like transit going in Atlanta.
So one of the big economic drivers in many ways in Atlanta in recent years has been the BeltLine project. And you've written a ton about this in your own writings and in the supporter report. Can you give our viewers just a little bit of overview about what the BeltLine has done positively and negatively for the city?
So Atlanta is basically ran by 3 rings. So you have the outer ring of 285, which is where our cars go, the inner ring of what now is going to be the Atlanta BeltLine, and then the city limits. So it's like a series of concentric rings going in. The Atlanta BeltLine was actually birthed with really good intentions. Ryan Gravel, the actual creator of it, Georgia Tech graduate, he saw a lot of unused rail lines, and he saw that these particular rail lines could be used for both transit and parks and connecting neighborhoods that normally would never have been connected. The idea was good. The execution actually was pretty good on the park itself. The thing that I think Ryan had to step away from, and that a lot of people have criticisms about, is that they took all of his design ideas and none of the other principles that he built in, which is like equity, affordability, and almost like an anti-gentrification effort to which everybody was supposed to benefit from it. And so it's been really a mess ever since then. So they took the plans, they took the infrastructure, but they took none of the other parts of it. And so now we see why the BeltLine has essentially been one of the greatest drivers of wealth in Atlanta, but also one of the greatest drivers of inequality.
Right, and I think Atlanta now tops the list, right, of most unequal cities.
Income inequality in the city.
Yeah, income inequality, and I would imagine real estate inequality as well.
Right, and around that issue of the BeltLine, so the Atlanta BeltLine was supposed to create 5,600 units of affordable housing. The last count I saw, they were still under 800, almost 10 years into the project. And there's reasons for that. Some of the funding that they used, unfortunately, they were using tax-exempt bonds right before the recession hit. But the other piece is really this question of equity and where are they placing the importance? And with the importance being on creating commercial and market rate units and leaving out that affordable housing piece, now they're trying to play catch up and it's not really working.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the problems Atlanta particularly has faced was because of its history, right? This was a city that wasn't planned, that was just kind of thrown together after the Civil War, quickly became our state's capital because it had railroad lines crossing, it had a little bit of infrastructure left, even after the destruction of Sherman marching through. But as Kevin Cruz describes in his book on white flight, Atlanta has seen several iterations of white people fleeing and then coming back into the city. And that has really exacerbated this inequality, right?
It's not just white people moving, it's the type of white person who moves out, which I think is more interesting, is that in every case, for the most part, it's usually those who have wealth who move out the first and they move out the farthest and they come back in and it becomes like this ripple of just money moving in and out. And in the process, for the most part, Atlanta's pockets become more inequitable. So we can go through neighborhood by neighborhood to see when a neighborhood had a certain level of population of people with a certain demographic, and then when it changed, and you can just drive through in real time today and kind of see that, which is really fascinating.
And of course, as we know, with the last housing crash, with the last bubble, I mean, that's what really decimated Black wealth on a national level, right? I mean, white people have made up any of the losses almost completely, and Black Americans have still not made up half of what they lost in the last recession.
Right. Whether you like it or not, homeownership is the #1 wealth driver in our country. That is the way that most families build their wealth. That's having reverberating effects that are going to last generations.
And I think homeownership, not just, it's also with Black millennials in particular. I look at Black millennials and Black Gen Zs. I don't even know if that group of people is ever going to even reach the same level of homeownership as their parents did or their grandparents did. And so going forward, it's going to be interesting to see how that wealth dynamic is going to play out when you have a younger generation who probably just will not own homes, period.
And of course, that's all tied up as well in student debt, right? And the incredible inequality there. I just read a study this weekend that 95% of Black students cannot repay their loans because of the history of slavery and Jim Crow and destruction of Black wealth by white Americans. The history of that legacy is being borne out by student debt. People from all over the state, people from all over the South come to Atlanta. If you're a smart, talented person in the countryside or even in Mississippi or Alabama or South Carolina, you're coming to Atlanta and you're coming there for an education or a job. And then this exacerbates the problems we're talking about.
Absolutely. And I think, too, we have to talk about the film industry and the ways that that's moved into Georgia and Atlanta. And if you're coming from LA, Atlanta might seem extremely affordable, but they are part of what's causing these rents to rise and rise and rise and make it unaffordable for younger people that want to move into the city.
And then the other thing about the film industry, too, is that I don't think people understand like the level in which somebody from LA or somebody like New York could actually afford. And so for Atlanta, the majority of people who come and work in film are actually like transient people. So they mostly get hired for 3 to 6 months. They come out of New York and LA. And what really happens is that, let's say hypothetically, a company like Disney will rent out 10 different apartments, 10 different condos throughout the city. And so even though it seems like it's vacant on paper, that particular company, in the case of Disney, a $250 billion company, can reserve 100 rooms in Atlanta, pay the $3,000 to $7,000 a month for rent, and just hold them in case they need to move talent in and out. And so we see a lot of that kind of driving up the prices as well, particularly in the rental market, because they can afford to do so.
I mean, this all ties into when there was a public outcry, most of it feigned, I would say, when Georgia passed the restrictive, almost anti-abortion laws. The film industry, many people in the film industry said they were going to pull out. Well, that has not happened. And in fact, we've had one of our best years, right? Calling ourselves the Hollywood of the South, I think Governor Kemp said a few weeks ago.
It's going to take a minute for all the leases to kind of expire and like some of the agreements they have. So really, I think that the next 3 years are going to be more important to see if the film industry stays in Georgia or not, because Netflix and Disney are the biggest users of our sound stages here in the state of Georgia. They have, most of them have commitments through 2021, 2022. So it times out just coincidentally when like the next governor's election goes on. And considering Brian Kemp and what he's done so far, if he decides to only stick right here, I think it's okay. But if he goes any further with any other kind of issues, I think that they're gonna either A, just not renew like their agreements of these spaces, or B, just pull out altogether. Most likely it'll be A, just because financially they don't really want to do that. So I think it's gonna take time.
Right. And again, when you have all these other southern states that are voting the same way, and even now all of the Midwest, I mean, these laws are making their way through the country. So at some point, it's not just us. What do you think is a real way that we can address some of these major issues? I commonly say to people that are smart, well-versed in politics, that we need to get together in the South and have an actual brain trust. Sit down with all the experts and hash it out and figure out what we can do politically, because the movement is there. The movement is there underfoot, grassroots movement, but we don't have one kind of collective, one central organization, kind of leader, anything. What do you guys think is the best way to address this?
Well, I think the number one thing you can do is talk to your friends and then take your friends with you to vote. I think that that's really what it's going to come down to, is putting in new political leaders who are willing to talk about these issues and do something about them.
It does seem like there's a lack of central unification, I think, for the most part, because people don't know what to unify behind. And I think that's still a bit of an issue, because there's some people who are very local level who want to get things done. There's some people national level. And then even on those particular platforms, no one's been like, all right, this is what we're going to focus on, the 5, 6, 7 things, and we're going to attack them that way. So until somebody kind of figures out what those are, I think you'll kind of see a lot of disjointed efforts.